This is the Dallas Morning News.
I'm Talmage Boston, and welcome to this edition of Cross-Examining History, published and promoted by the Dallas Morning News, where we explore America's fascinating past with our country's leading historians and thought leaders. For this podcast, I interviewed best-selling author Bryan Burrough about his new book, The Gunfighters, How Texas Made the West Wild. His book came out on June 3rd, 2025, and we did the program in front of a live audience in Dallas on October 22nd, 2025. Enjoy.
Good morning. Bryan, come on over. If you can get out from over there. Okay. I'm Talmage Boston. I want to welcome all of you to our exclusive conversation series. Bryan has never been in this room before. He was somewhat wowed.
I'm a big fan of nice rooms.
But anyway, let's get started. Our special guest, Bryan Burrough, who I think just about everybody has now met. Bryan grew up in Texas, in scenic Temple, Texas, Bell County, where my family's from. But Bryan now lives in Austin after spending most of his adult life in New York and New Jersey. He wrote for the Wall Street Journal, Vanity Fair, and he's currently the editor-at-large of Texas Monthly. This is his 8th book. 4 of them have been New York Times bestsellers. This one was the front page of the summer book section of the Wall Street Journal when it came out a few months ago. So it's a big book. It's a fun book that we're going to talk about in a minute. But please welcome Bryan Burrough. You want to say thanks?
Talmage, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Can I just put the tiniest word of context in here?
Sure.
Because I know if y'all work hard for a living and you don't think about books all the time, you may not appreciate how rare this type of gathering is. I will tell you right now, having released a number of books in Texas over the last 15 years, there is nothing like this morning's gathering happening anywhere in the state. Every now and then you get a nice invitation to a country club dinner or some such, but what Talmage and the sponsors and the backers and all of you are doing is highly unusual, if not unique. I can tell you I chair a club of 97 nonfiction authors in Austin. And 75 of them know about this group, and 50 of them have their hands up. And so it's a real honor that I got the call.
Well, great. So my standard opening question, and that is, Bryan, you've written your past books about many different subjects: the FBI and the 70s underground, the gangsters of the 1930s, Wall Street in the 1980s, the Alamo, Texas oil fortunes. So this is a change of pace. What was it about this subject matter that inspired you to write this book?
The subject matter I have been fascinated with since long before I knew I was a reporter. I grew up in Temple, as you referenced. And from the age of about 11, I knew my horizon was to be a newspaper reporter. My dream back in those days, this is circa 1973, was to be a cops reporter at the Dallas Morning News. I thought that was as far as I could see.
We have some good folks from the Morning News over here.
I do, and I've met them. Hey, y'all. And, you know, I was the second in my family to go to college. Most of my family is poor from Arkansas. And that was as far as I could see. And as I went out into the world, I ended up at the Wall Street Journal, where I learned a lot more of the world than I grew up with. And I was given the opportunity to write books. And after I wrote a book in 2004 called Public Enemies, which is a darn good book and an okay Michael Mann, Christian Bale, Johnny Depp movie. It's an okay movie. It's in video. It's weird. I went into my publisher and they said, so what you gonna do next? And I said, well, I'm gonna do Old West Gunfighters. And then I kind of mic dropped and I was gonna turn around and just say, yeah, I'll give it to you. I'll see you in 3 or 4 years. And first time my editor ever said, wait. What's the story? And I'm like, I don't know what the story is. I'll figure that out when I get into it. And he said, well, look, this cannot be a book about 17 chapters on 17 gunfighters. There has to be a story. Now it's like, shit. So I went off and did The Big Rich, and it took me 12 years to come up with a theme that felt fresh and new, that I felt would connect everyone as disparate as Jesse James to Billy the Kid to Wyatt Earp. And that's what this book is. It took me, I signed to do it in 2018. They actually let me off for 2 years to go write another book. And then I came back. So it took me 5-6 years. And it was a joy. You always know you're on. I always know things are going really well when every night I look forward to getting back to my desk in the morning. That's always a good sign. When people like my books, and they are long and they are dense, when people like my books, when they really get into it, and they say, wow, I could tell you were having a good time. And that's what this book was. I might just say one other thing. It is a departure for me in that, if any of y'all know my early stuff, Barbarians of the Gate, Big Rich, got cited a lot over here in the line. They are long and dense, and they're kind of classic American journalists telling you an important story, lots of research. And in the last book I did, and this may not get me a lot of fans in the room, it's called Forget the Alamo. It came out a few years ago, and it's a revisionist history of Texas. And because I thought we would have a hostile audience, because I needed Texans to have their minds and hearts open to some different ideas, I adopted a very conversational tone, almost like just you and me talking. And it turned out that the tone and the approach went over very well. And my publisher said, hey, if you want to keep writing like this, just go ahead. We think this works. So this is a very casual conversational book, like we're just sitting down having a cup of sweet tea.
A couple of examples.
Oh, goodness.
Bryan, on here, this is, turn to page 85, and I've bracketed, the conversational part is his humor.
Well,
read about a Texas
Higgins.
rancher named John Pinkney.
This is just 3 lines, and it's a little gross. This is before breakfast, so I apologize for what he's asking me to read. But yeah, this was one of my real worries about this book is I'm attempting to induce a chuckle or two in a book about gun violence. What could go wrong, right? So here's the sentence. There's a story often told about Pink Higgins, how after stumbling upon a rustler butchering one of his steers, he shot the man, stuffed his body into the disemboweled animal, then rode into town to tell the sheriff he should come see a miracle, a cow giving birth to a man. You probably had to be there.
But you also, as this conversational style, have fun with metaphors. So turn to page 86, and describing a cowboy and Texas Ranger named Scott Corley.
Oh, God, Scott Cooley.
Cooley.
Scary dude. A good deal of the early part of the book deals with feuds in Texas. Those that broke out around the state in the 10 and 15 years after the Civil War, when, of course, the state was undergoing a lot of upheavals. And this fella named Scott Cooley was a mainstay of the feud in Mason County, which had the single best name of all the feuds. It was known as the Hoodoo War, Hoodoo. Apparently they had a lot of Dutch and German settlers, and hoodoo was some type of scary word. It was around then that a one-time Texas Ranger named Scott Cooley arrived in town, vowing to offend his friend's murder. Cooley is one of the Old West's scarier figures. He was certainly one of the angriest. Raised on the North Texas Comanche frontier at its worst, he had grown up devoting as much time and energy to fighting and killing and scalping Native Americans as my kids did to Nintendo.
How's that for a metaphor? All right, so when I first saw what your book was about, I'm 72 years old. I grew up watching television series, Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, Bat Masterson, so forth. And the eye-opener about this book is that how much fiction there was in telling these stories that we grew up with and being entertained by and so forth. So if they made TV shows and movies that were factually accurate about Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and Jesse James and Billy the Kid and Butch Cassidy, those would be pretty short shows.
It's funny you say that. I have a friend, Charles, I'm forgetting his name right now, whose editor urged him to write a new biography on Butch Cassidy about 6-7 years ago. And without doing a lot of advanced research, I imagine the money was right. He said, sure. And he gets about a year into it, and he calls me and goes, there's no new information, and there's not much information. I do not know what I'm going to do. That is a common problem. These people, they did not run around with biographers. They did not tend to give a ton of interviews, and those that they did were often, pretty self-serving. I would say, though, about movies, that it is easy for us to say what is true, and that is that the literature, and especially the movies and TV shows that we've seen about Old West gunfighters, were pretty bad through the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. But then you got that group of young filmmakers who rose in Hollywood circa 1970. So we're talking Coppola, Scorsese, Lucas, those guys, introduced a new wave of young filmmakers who really wanted to make authentic, real, actual, historically accurate films. I begin it with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which, while not note by note accurate, is pretty darn close to accurate. You go all the way up to the kind of sadly depressing Kevin Costner, Wyatt Earp, or the great Kurt Russell Tombstone in 1993. Those movies are, I would say, 80% accurate. There's only 20% bullshit, which it's Hollywood. You got to give them some.
But the TV series were bullshit.
TV series were pretty much bullshit. Yeah.
So you say that in terms of why is all this so entertaining to us from a young age and so forth, a great quote, those who pursue settled lives, i.e. people like us, have long been fascinated by those who don't. So that being the case, explain your conclusion that the stories of the outlaws of the gunfighter era from 1866 to 1901 became associated by so many law-abiding people as embodying American individualism in pursuit of the American dream.
Two things going on here. One is just to acknowledge how unusual these people were. We're still talking about them 150 years later, and all they did was shoot people. Like, there's no other period, I would say, in world history where we're still talking about civilian gun violence. And it wasn't even unusual at the time. As I say in the prologue, people shot each other in the streets of Boston and Baltimore every day in the 1870s, and you've never heard of one of them. And yet these people did it in Kansas, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, and we still know their names. We could still read about them in a book. That fascinated me, why that is. And I came up with two ideas that you reference. One is that, yes, I've always believed that people who lead settled lives, who do the right thing, who do what society and our elders largely taught us to do, who follow the rules, we are fascinated by those who don't. It's the same reason we're fascinated with Bonnie and Clyde, because they threw off all the rules. They did everything they wanted and anything they wanted, and they got away with it. And the only thing better than the fact that they got away with it is in the end, they didn't. In the end, Frank Hamer shot them down, and to me, that is a subtle reminder to every one of us that we are right to live by our rules, that if you go out and live like Bonnie and Clyde or one of these guys, you will pay the price. So I think there's a deep appeal there. But I also think, as you reference, it does say a little something about the country. I don't want to get too hoity-toity here, but I think that the Old West became the origin story of America for many of us. When you start telling somebody about America, do you really sit and think about George Washington and guys in powdered wigs? You don't. I think we think about the Old West because it speaks of possibility to us. The phrase the American dream gets thrown out around a lot, and it means something a little different to everybody. But to me, it's always meant something adjacent to this idea that any man, woman, or child, given the proper conditions, can make something of themselves, maybe be rich or be famous in America. It is part of at its core is individualism. And that's what the Old West has always meant for us. It was a place in reality and in our collective memory where anybody could go into the middle of nowhere and make something of themselves. And I argue softly that the gunfighter is the purest incarnation of that. One man alone with the great equalizer, a gun. It doesn't matter if the guy who's threatening me or my girlfriend is 7 foot tall. If I've got a Navy Colt, we're equal. And I think that something about that speaks to us as well.
Now, your book's subtitle is How Texas Made the West Wild. And you say, quote, "Take away Texans and the American gunfighter era shrinks to insignificance." So what was it about Texans that made them such indispensable characters to the gunfighter era?
This surprised me. I did not know this going in. The connective tissue in this book is not the male honor system of America in the 19th century. How men challenged in America, especially in the South and in Texas, could get pretty uppity, and violence would ensue. That system grew in the Old South. Texas was part of that. But three things happened in Texas that I think informed this gunfighter era. I don't want to say it caused it. I don't want to say Texans were responsible for all of it. But I do want to argue that the contributions of Texans to all this legend, are underappreciated today. Three things went on. One, Texas had that Southern honor system. It was always a place where if you insulted a man or his wife or his horse, you were likely to get a punch in the nose or a bullet. That's just the way the South was in the mid-19th century. But in Texas, two things combined after the war, in the decade after the Civil War, to make Texas what you can still read in some academic studies was the bloodiest place for civilian violence for 10 years. One was the undeclared rebellion that we launched against the forces of the Union that invaded us after the war. We did not take that well, and our response was highly violent and led to some of the bloodiest feuds in American history across North and East Texas especially. And second was the rise of our first great business, open-range cattle ranching, which had existed on the plains below San Antonio before the war. But after it basically froze and atrophied, and the cattle do what cattle do. We had 5x cattle by 1866 than we did in 1860. When that business exploded across the West, first up the cattle trails, the Chisholm Trail and others to Kansas, but then also across every western state. All their cattle businesses came from us. And with that cattle went Texas cowboys, Texas cattlemen, and that industry was an extraordinarily violent industry. Not anything to do really with Texans, but if you know anything about cattle and sheep herding societies, going back to Scotland and Ireland, they're legendarily violent because when you put your animals out on the open range, your biggest problem is always theft. After weather, it's theft. So the people who run herding societies, whether in Temple or Texas or Old Scotland, they have always developed ways to use violence to dissuade those who would steal their livestock. And it made the Texas cattle business a uniquely violent business in the 1870s.
That reminded me, my granddaddy who raised cattle in Bell County taught me early on, you never ask a cattleman, how many cows do you have? Because that's like, how much money do you have?
It's like asking how many acres on your ranch.
Right.
You don't do it.
You just don't do it. All right, but in terms of the start, maybe really started before the Civil War, you say the California Gold Rush, this gift for metaphors, the California Gold Rush had bandits the way the Okefenokee Swamp had mosquitoes. So what made the gold rush in the 1850s trigger, ultimately, the gunfighter era?
Well, don't you know it was because of Texans? Seriously, if the gunfighter era, which I'm defining because I get to it, it's my book, was 1865 to 1901. Many of you may know that that it was all made possible by a leap in technology. That is the introduction of the first Colt revolver. Devised by a young nobody named Samuel Colt in Massachusetts, introduced just months after the Alamo in 1837. You may remember before that, we're talking mostly single-shot flintlocks. Well, you can't kill a lot of people when you shoot, load for 40 seconds, and shoot again, you're just getting them dead. It was the revolver that made the Old West-style violence that we now see on TV and movies. It was the revolver that made that possible. And when Colt first introduced that revolver in 1837, crickets. Nothing happened. It was too big, it was too unwieldy, it took far too long to unload. By 1844, Samuel Colt was out of business. He was nobody. And it was then that a young Texas Ranger named Sam Hayes came across a crate of these revolvers, these Colt revolvers. I imagine they were in a warehouse. And my favorite line of the book may be, they had once been owned by, wait for it, the Texas Navy. Don't you love that we used to have a Navy? When the Navy was disbanded, the guns were left in this warehouse, I imagine. Hayes thought, well, we're getting our asses kicked by the Comanche in the hill country. So he taught his men how to use these revolvers. And even though they were big and unwieldy, they shot the hell out of a number of Comanche groups, at which point a young Texas Ranger named Sam Walker went back east to find this Colt guy and improve this weapon. They did it. They came up with a smaller, faster, much easier to use weapon. They came to be called the Walker Colt, which was the father of all basically personal weaponry. And that gun was introduced in the 1848-49 timeframe, and when gold was found in California, it was really the gold rush was the first place where we saw people turn revolvers on each other in a serious way. Yes, on outlaws, there was a lot of law in Gold Rush, California. So I kind of view the personal violence and the gunfighters and the outlaws of old California as kind of a prelude to the violence that really erupted out of Texas after the war. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the same stuff, it's just same behaviors, but for whatever reason, the violence, the gunfighters of old California just got forgotten. Mm-hmm. And those that came out of Texas from John Wesley Hardin and Doc Holliday and Ben Thompson,
Sam Bass,
we still know of them.
Yep. Now, your book talks about how the gunfighter era moved across the country from state to state. From the north, it went west from Texas to New Mexico to Arizona. It went north from Texas to Oklahoma to Kansas. So explain the geographical progression associated with this.
Let me just briefly establish what we're talking about. A gunfighter, as it's commonly understood today, is anyone who exchanged gunfire in the Old West with civilians. So if it was Native Americans or soldiers involved, that's not gunfighting. What you found was that the first gunfights, look, there had been plenty of gun violence in Texas after the war, and we talk about it. I think of it as like this gathering storm that once we started moving cattle across the Old West, just burst out onto the rest. So the first place was up the Chisholm Trail to Kansas. The Kansas cow towns, from Abilene and Wichita to Dodge City, there's 5 of them, were really kind of the Madison Square Garden of this gunfire era. They're the first place where gunfights suddenly begin getting national attention. People start writing about it and start going, wait, what are these Texans doing and why are they getting so mad? You know, I mean, it was just the rest of the country, which was considerably more sedate than frontier Texas, you know, expressed a good deal of surprise at these behaviors. And then, you know, so when you look at, and this book is a study of what I call the marquee gunfights of the Old West, meaning the notable ones, those that made newspapers, those that made the history books. The first ones are all Kansas. And when Kansas quietened in the mid-1870s, you can see that a lot of the marquee violence, the gunfights that we remember most clearly, they tracked the movements and the flow of Texas cattlemen, first across New Mexico, Arizona, and later Colorado and Wyoming. It's impossible to overstate the imprint that Texas cattlemen made. We practically, during the 1870s, colonized New Mexico and practically colonized Arizona in the 1880s. Like half the people who lived in those states were Texas cowboys.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the most famous gunfight from watching television and movies took place in a vacant lot outside Tombstone, Arizona, that was known as the OK Corral. It lasted a grand total of 30 seconds. It involved the firing of 30 bullets from the guns of 7 men, 3 of whom died. So how did this brief encounter that lasted half a minute become the stuff of legend?
If you have one thing to take away from this morning, and I am here to make you sparkling dinner party companions, The next time you're at a dinner party and somebody brings up the Old West, you just say, well, you know, it's not the gunfight at the OK Corral. And someone's going to say, bullshit, it was too. And you're going to say, no, it was the gunfight beside the OK Corral. You can thank me later. The reason, let's be clear, the gunfight at the OK Corral was not a massive piece of news when it happened in October of 1881. It made page 3 of the Philadelphia paper. That's about and it was a blurb. That's about the biggest impact you can say. It was regionally well known. It was news in San Francisco and in the Western newspapers, as were the events that followed it. But by and large, it did not reach the national consciousness until the 1920s, 40 years later. It's true that when the frontier closed in the 1990s, there was not an outburst of either literature or history books written about the West. It was practically forgotten until 1925, when a magazine writer started off an article with a line that couldn't be said today. The first line of the article was, "Who remembers Billy the Kid?" At that point, there was an explosion of renewed interest in the Old West. And every writer and every screenwriter that wanted to write about the West searched out those gunfighters and their acolytes who were still alive. You know who was still alive? Not many of them. Wyatt Earp was still alive, and he was hanging around Hollywood backlots, you know, dipping snuff and being a technical advisor on bad westerns. And suddenly he's talking to biographers, and suddenly the gunfight beside the OK Corral becomes a big deal only in the 1920s. And then it becomes a new Hollywood movie, I'm telling you, every 5 years. Into the 1970s, when it's every 2 years. And most of them are crap. But the Tombstone, Kurt Russell, that's good. I mean, it's a well-made ensemble movie. It's not 100% accurate. There was no mass murder of Latinos outside a church in this opening thing, okay? But that was an adequate summation of the terror that this outlaw group brought to Tombstone. I love that movie, and I endorse it.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've twice mentioned Billy the Kid, and in the book you have not one but 2 chapters on him.
3.
3.
I counted.
Okay, thanks. Billy the Kid died at the ripe old age of 22. So how did he gain such notoriety in such a short period of time?
That's a good question. Look, Billy the Kid is the most ambivalent character in the book, and one of the most ambivalent in the Old West. I could write you 15 books and give you 15 believable and back-upable, if that's a word, versions of Billy the Kid. I can give you Billy the Kid as a hero, Billy the Kid as a fiendish villain, and they'd all be true, because during his lifetime, he was portrayed in the New Mexico press as a cattle thief and a murderer, which is what he was. But there were elements of his story that caused the jaw to drop, and they go, wow, there's something to him. The legend really was born the morning that he escaped from the jail in Lincoln. He was there for murder, a murder he committed, and he shot the 2 deputies and made his way off. And when the governor sent parties after him, you know, he got in written correspondence with the governor. Those 2 things, a daring prison escape, which is after all what made John Dillinger so famous. There's nothing like an escape to get Americans, oh, that's interesting. And especially if it looks kind of daring, we tend to ascribe laudable qualities to such people. And the other thing that got people's attention about Billy is the people in New Mexico, in his region, were loyal to him. They protected him, especially Latinos. He became a hero of Latino New Mexicans. They scouted for him, they warned him, they were his people. And so there were laudable elements of that story even then. But they really didn't come out until this idea of Billy the Kid as a laudable figure didn't really catch hold until modern days, till the 20s, 30s, 40s.
Mm-hmm. Now, another famous outlaw that you write about, John Wesley Hardin, for whom Bob Dylan named an album, claiming in a song that Hardin was a friend to the poor. Tell us the story of Hardin. Was that true? Was he a friend to the poor? Was there anything good about John Wesley Hardin?
Okay, first, I want to take the temper of the room. Before this morning, before you Googled what is this book about, how many of you had actually heard of John Wesley Hardin? Okay, everybody.
Bob Dylan fans.
Okay, so that's 20% of you, and you're all over 60 like me. John Wesley Hardin deserves to be more notorious. He was the first. If your vision of a gunfighter is from Have Gun Will Travel, or The Rifleman, or one of those 50 TV shows that maybe you watched in syndication, the archetype is this gunfighter who wanders the West and he solves problems and he, saves young damsels. John Wesley Hardin was the architect for that. He was the first. He emerged in Texas at the age of 15, killing his first person in 1868, and by 1874, with not being an outlaw, not robbing anything, never being a lawman, just a wandering cattleman and gambler who just somehow got in a lot of arguments. In those 6 years, he killed between 26 and 42 people. He was the black, dark version of the roving gunfighter that saved damsels. He roved the Texas countryside and occasionally Kansas, just shooting men in the face if he got into an argument with it. Into the 50s and 60s, he was still pretty much a household name. You get the sense in Texas. I can drop his name around men of a certain age, and they'll tell me a Hardin story. And the other 9 people in the room, I'm getting blank stares like, he's who? He did what? No, come on, you're making that stuff up. Part of it is that he rose at a time from like 1868 to 1874 when there were not a ton of reliable news outlets in the state of Texas. He lived long enough to write an autobiography, amazingly. He was really the only major gunfighter, other than I think Cole Younger, to do it. And people, ever since that book came out in the 1890s, not a lot of people, but people like me, have been poring over that book trying to figure out how much of it is believable. Could he really have shot 3 men near Belton, killed them, and it made no news story anywhere? Well, maybe, given that there was no newspaper between Galveston and Dallas at the time, yes. So I just think Hardin is a figure of fascination and mystery that deserves to be a little bit better known. There's 1 or 2 really good books about it, but a lot of it is still kind of detective work, trying to figure out what he actually did.
I mean, to the extent you fall in love with this subject matter after reading Bryan's book, throughout the book, he tells you many of the books he used for the basis for his research, some of which he acknowledges are very good, some of which he acknowledges are crap. So this can be a good guide to your future research.
That was one of the ideas, is that I wanted this to be kind of Gunfighter for Dummies. This assumes you know nothing. This assumes you or someone you know, perhaps your father, it's often the father, wants to know more about this. So I was like, I'd never seen other writers do this. And so I just have all these footnotes that say, hey, if you want to read more about Billy the Kid, these are the 2 books you want to read. Ignore these other ones. And some authors are really happy with me right now, and some are not.
Now, by 1901, the gunfighter era was coming to an end. So what was it that caused it to slow down and ultimately stop?
The spread of civilization, the march of civilization. Certainly one of the sub-themes of the book is kind of the maturation of the West, especially law enforcement. It starts in the days after the Civil War when, people like John Wesley Hardin are out shooting people in the face and walking away with no sheriff or anybody saying, hey, maybe we should arrest him, until the 1890s when you find actually the dawn of something like professional modern law enforcement. By the time the Dalton gang is at large in Oklahoma, they've got federal task forces chasing them with trains. So that's kind of cool to watch that advance. But more than anything, it's just people flooded into the West. Where all those cattle were, suddenly you had farmers. And they want law. They don't want drunken cowboys running up and down the streets of their town. And, the West continued to be a rowdy place well into the 20th century. But I think it's fair to say in 1901, I end the book, and now you tell me what you think. I'm defining this era, the gunfighter era. And I say that it ends when Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid get on that freighter for Argentina in 1901. Because after that, you've never heard of anybody who shoots anybody. So I'm like, when the last household names leave the country because there's too much law, there's too many Pinkertons, that felt like the end to me. I keep waiting for an argument and nobody's given it to me yet.
All right, I want to close the interview, Bryan, by having you read your book's last 5 sentences, which I thought were just dazzling.
Wow, thank you.
It's on page what?
382.
Page 382. Everybody pull out your books, since you all have books. But this is brilliant.
Well, I want to read the one before it too.
Go ahead.
I want to, look, I am aware that gun violence today, in fact, I haven't even said this, is obviously a political topic. It's polarizing. And this book is not about that. This book is about the 19th century. But I'm aware that there are people who dislike guns, who would have us revoke the second, who think that telling the stories of these men is glorifying violence in some way. So I said, there are those who feel these stories glorify the kind of violence many would like to see wither and die. I can understand such sentiments, but what I know is that history doesn't go away. It can't be ignored into disappearing, nor am I sure doing so in this case would accrue any serious benefit any more than banning stories of serial killers would reduce murder rates. To those who wish it would, I can only say what almost any historian might. The surest way to address history, especially its unpleasant aspects, is to engage with it, to learn. The truth, whether about fabulists like Wild Bill Hickok and Bill Longley, murderers like Jesse James and Wes Hardin, or those like Wyatt Earp who tried to limit such men, tends to win in the end.
How about that?
That's the only moment I'm going to get up on my little soapbox and preach to you, I promise.
All right, so we have time for questions from the audience. Yes, Jeff.
Wesley Hardin, fact or fiction? Was he so mean he shot a man for snoring? Wesley Hardin the one that shot a man for snoring? Was that off on?
That tells me most people know that story because it was used to advertise the Time Life series of Old West books in the 1970s. You have got to be my age to remember these books. They're in leather. You can still find them on Amazon, and they're classic. So the story that they told to advertise the one about gunfighters, also their book was called The Gunfighters, was John Wesley Hardin was so mean he killed a man for snoring. Which, of course, every liberal and academic in the world is like, oh yeah, right, legend, pure legend. The facts are this. August 1971, John Wesley Hardin was...
1871.
Of course. John Wesley Hardin was in Abilene, Kansas at the end of a trail drive. He had already killed, by my count, 6 men that summer. When a Texas cattleman, is found dead in his hotel room, and there are bullet holes in the wall. Someone has shot through the wall 4 times and killed the man. The marshal, who happened to be Wild Bill Hickok himself, responded immediately. Hardin saw him coming, jumped off a roof, and made his way back and rode back to Texas. And he was not arrested. He was not brought to justice. In fact, he wasn't even pursued. The story arose years later, after he was in prison, that he killed this man for snoring. And as long as that story has circulated, people have just said, oh, come on, that's Texas legend. But I ask you, what other possible reason is there for shooting a man through a hotel room wall in the middle of the night? They were not arguing about cards. They were not insulting each other because they couldn't see each other. So no, I cannot prove he killed that man for snoring, but I can't think of a better reason.
Other question? Yes, Bryan.
The concept that this is just basically civilian on civilian gun violence, like, it's completely eye-opening to me, because it's like, oh yeah, that makes complete sense. But because of that, it made me think, okay, all these, hey, this guy is estimated to kill 20 to 40 people. Well, that's what we know about. Do you have an estimate of what actually out there? Because if they're just on the road, they shoot somebody, there's nobody there to document it.
I think in the autobiography, it comes to 42. And I think that the actual number that people who debate such things, probably the average is 20 people accept 25 of those. And easily 12 or 15 are documented. In fact, that's the lowest number I see for Hardin is 12 to 15. I had thought about, at some point, including a scorecard at the back of the book, so that people would have a ranking to at least, but at least, as silly as that sounds, one of the things we all have a problem with is understanding the difference between a significant gunfighter and an insignificant one. They're all doing the same thing. The only one that distinguishes one from the other is he killed more people. In the end, I thought, I actually didn't think that that's just too crass to do. I thought there was no way to make an effective call about how many actually people they kill. I ended up with these claims of numbers. Hardin might be 42, probably is 25. And it was weak. So
I think it's more like 100.
No, because in his autobiography, he pretty much he claimed he wasn't leaving anything out, dude. I mean, it was all there. So I just took 42 as kind of the high number. We have one guy named Deacon Jim Miller, who, when he was hung, when he was lynched by a lynch mob that took him out of a jail in Ada, Oklahoma in 1909, his last words were, "Let the record show I have killed 51 men." We include Deacon Jim Miller in the book, but with an asterisk because he was not a gunfighter. He was a paid assassin, an actual paid assassin, like a hitman, like you see in movies. And I believe that if he killed 51 men, 45 of them were from ambush. So he doesn't really count.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yeah, Eric.
One of my great fears about this book is that these are some rough characters. These are, by and large, not men you would hire to babysit your 14-year-old daughter. I don't find a lot of moral uplift in a number of the stories, Hardin's, among others. And I confess, I was looking to embrace someone that not only I liked, but I thought a reader would like. And the name that I'll give you that is not going to surprise the soul is Wyatt Earp. Because while many of us, probably much of what you know about Wyatt Earp is from the movies, and the movies have been very kind to Wyatt Earp in recent years. But if you talk to the aficionados, those who know that he was an escaped federal prisoner, that he and his brothers had been pimps, it is very cool these days to diss Wyatt Earp, to take him down. There have been entire books, and I can't do it. I've read everything out there, and to me, he was the real deal. In an age where routinely lawmen were corrupt, cowards, or just incompetent drunks, if you study what he did in Wichita, if you study especially what he did in Dodge City when he worked with Bat Masterson, you see a professional, hardworking lawman doing his best to keep that town safe, to do it repeatedly without gunfire, but by his preferred method of subduing a drunken cowboy was to hit him over the head with a heavy revolver. I think, I argue that Wyatt Earp is the kind of the shining moral center at the core of the Western myth. He's the good guy we all want, and he's there. And I would have no problem giving unfortunately my sons are now 31 and 29, but if they were younger, giving them a Wyatt Earp biography, the one on Casey by Casey Tiefertiller is the one I recommend, and say, you could do worse than to be Wyatt Earp. Great question.
That brings up the point that you develop in your book, and that is, if I'm a member of the town council of some town where cattle drives are coming through, and it's time to hire a new sheriff, well, you're not necessarily looking for the guy who has the highest moral character or education or anything else. You're looking for somebody who's really good with a gun.
Yeah, and if you do find a man with a moral component to hire as the marshal of Dodge City in 1878, it's not because you were looking for him, it's because you got lucky. People always, I love when people tut about something about the American condition when they note how many outlaws in the Old West became sheriffs and then became outlaws again. Look, there weren't that many jobs. Town councils just needed somebody who was good with a gun, or at least thought to be good with a gun who could intimidate drunks. Because drunks were the biggest problem in the Old West. There was almost no bank robbery and very little stagecoach robbery. The main problem was drunks. And so you needed somebody who could effectively subdue drunks. Wyatt Earp was fabulous at that. But you're right, many, including his successors in Dodge City, were some bad dudes.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, we're so glad you came. If you haven't gotten your book signed, we got one more question over here.
So you're okay. All hands for those who have watched both movies. Who likes the Dennis Quaid Doc Holliday? Who likes the Val Kilmer? Yeah, I like the Val Kilmer, better performance. I think the Dennis Quaid is much closer to reality. This is a great question to wrap up with, because as prominent as Dallas was on the frontier of the Old West, Doc Holliday is really the only gunfighter who stays here for any length of time without going into massive amounts of detail. He was a dentist, hence Doc, who came west for his tuberculosis. Unfortunately, tuberculosis does cause you to cough an awful lot. This turns out to be not the greatest thing for a dentist.
Hinders your business development.
Yes, so he also, probably to ease tubercular pain, he became an alcoholic. And in dentists, when you're an alcoholic former dentist, about the best job you could possibly have is a gambler. He went to become a gambler, and his story ends, and he's known today essentially because of his friendship with Wyatt Earp, which, as you see it defined in those two movies, I believe that's pretty close to the truth. I believe he was a wayward soul who was attracted to Wyatt because Wyatt seemed to stand for something, seemed to be a more solid, less itinerant version of a Western man that he was never going to be. And he saved his life more than once. And, I think their friendship is one of the great moments of the Old West. I really think it was, I know how profound this sounds. It was just really cool.
All right, well, we're going to respect your schedule. I know everybody's got to go to work, but
thank y'all.
Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you, that's wonderful.
In his new book, Bryan Burrough has certainly painted a vivid and accurate picture of the Wild West during the gunfighter era from 1866 to 1901. Make sure you catch all my podcasts published and promoted by the Dallas Morning News on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, and the Washington Independent Review of Books. This is Talmage Boston with my podcast series, Cross-Examining History. Thanks for listening.